In just 47 seconds, what started as a seemingly friendly morning chat exploded into one of the most dramatic confrontations British television has ever witnessed. Gary Oldman, one of the most respected actors of his generation, ended up storming off Lorraine Kelly's show after a fiery argument that exposed shocking unprofessionalism and reckless accusations from the host herself. The cameras kept rolling as voices were raised, tempers flared, and the truth came pouring out in a moment that nobody saw coming. Before we dive into exactly what happened, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals. Hit that subscribe button now because you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Last night's episode of Lorraine started like any other morning show. The lights were bright, the set was colorful, and Lorraine Kelly welcomed Gary Oldman onto her famous sofa with her trademark smile. Gary walked out wearing a simple black jacket and jeans, waving to the audience who erupted in applause. He's an Oscar winner, a knight of the realm, and someone who British audiences have loved for decades. Lorraine stood up to greet him, shaking his hand before they both sat down. "Gary, wonderful to have you here," Lorraine said, still smiling as the applause died down. "It's been a while since we've seen you on morning television." "It has been, yeah," Gary replied, settling into the sofa. "Good to be here, Lorraine." The first few minutes seemed completely normal. Lorraine asked Gary about his latest film project, and he answered with the kind of thoughtful responses you'd expect from someone who spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He talked about the character he was playing, the director he was working with, and the challenges of filming in Eastern Europe during winter. Gary was relaxed, articulate, and the audience seemed engaged. "Now, Gary," Lorraine said, leaning forward slightly, "I want to talk about something that's been in the news lately. There's been quite a bit of discussion about actors from your generation and how the industry has changed." Gary nodded. "Sure, it's changed enormously. When I started out in the 80s, it was a completely different world." "Right, exactly," Lorraine continued. "And there's been some controversy recently about comments made by actors regarding diversity in casting. What's your take on that?" Gary paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Well, I think it's important that everyone gets opportunities based on talent. The industry should be open to everyone, and I've always believed that. I've worked with incredible actors from all backgrounds throughout my career." Lorraine's smile tightened just a fraction. "But you were quoted in an article last year saying something about traditional casting, weren't you?" "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Gary said, his brow furrowing slightly. "I've given a lot of interviews. Could you be more specific?" "Oh, come on, Gary," Lorraine said, and there was an edge to her voice now that hadn't been there before. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The article where you said you preferred when casting was based on the writer's original vision." Gary sat up a bit straighter. "I said that great writing should be respected, yes. That's not controversial. If a writer creates a specific character, there's value in honoring that vision. But I also said that interpretations can and should evolve. I don't think that's a problematic statement." The atmosphere in the studio shifted. The audience had gone quiet. You could feel the tension starting to build. "Some people found it problematic," Lorraine shot back. "Some people think that kind of thinking is exactly what's held back progress in the industry." Gary's expression changed. The friendliness was evaporating. "Lorraine, I've spent my entire career fighting for good work and good actors. I've championed people who weren't getting chances. I don't think it's fair to twist my words into something they're not." "I'm not twisting anything," Lorraine said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm asking you to account for what you said." "Account for it?" Gary repeated, and now there was genuine anger creeping into his voice. "I don't need to account for supporting good writing and good acting. That's my job. That's what I've done for 40 years. Lorraine wasn't backing down. "But don't you think, as someone with your platform and your privilege, you have a responsibility to be more careful about these things?" "Careful?" Gary said, and he actually laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Careful about what? About believing that talent matters? About thinking that writers deserve to have their work respected? What exactly should I be careful about?" The audience was completely silent now. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others were leaning forward, sensing that something bigger was about to happen. "You know what I mean," Lorraine pressed. "When you have the career you've had, when you've had the opportunities you've had, maybe you should think about how your words affect people who haven't had those same chances. Gary's jaw tightened. I came from nothing, Lorraine. I grew up in South London with a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep us fed. I didn't have opportunities handed to me. I worked my arse off for everything I've got. So don't sit there and lecture me about privilege like you know my story. I'm not lecturing you, Lorraine said, but her tone suggested otherwise. I'm asking you to be accountable. Accountable for what? Gary demanded. For having an opinion? For believing in craftsmanship? What crime have I committed here? This was the moment where things began to spiral. What had started as an uncomfortable exchange was now becoming a full-blown argument, and neither of them seemed willing to back down. Lorraine shuffled some papers on her desk, and when she looked back up at Gary, her expression had hardened. Let's talk about something else then, shall we? Your personal life. Gary's eyes narrowed. My personal life? What about it? Well, you've been married how many times now? 5? The audience gasped. This was crossing a line, and everyone in the studio knew it. That's really none of your business, Gary said, his voice low and controlled, but you could hear the anger underneath. It is when you're sitting on my show, Lorraine countered. You're a public figure. People want to know about you. There's a difference between being a public figure and having someone go through your private life on television, Gary said. I came here to talk about my work, not to have you dig into my relationships. Oh, come on, Lorraine said, waving her hand dismissively. You've talked about your marriages before. Why is it suddenly off limits now? Because it's not relevant, Gary said firmly. And because it's incredibly rude to sit there and count someone's marriages like you're keeping score. I've had relationships that didn't work out. So have millions of other people. It doesn't make me a bad person, and it certainly doesn't make me a bad actor. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, and there was something almost smug in her expression. I think it speaks to character, actually. I think people want to know if the actors they admire are stable, reliable people. Stable? Gary repeated, and his voice was getting louder now. You're questioning my stability because I've been divorced? That's bloody rich, Lorraine. Millions of people get divorced. It doesn't make them unstable. It makes them human. I'm just saying what people think, Lorraine said with a shrug. No, you're not, Gary shot back. You're saying what you think, and you're hiding behind this idea of representing people. You don't speak for everyone. You speak for yourself. The temperature in the studio was rising by the second. The crew behind the cameras were exchanging glances, clearly unsure if they should intervene or keep filming. The audience was completely transfixed. Gary, I think you're being very defensive, Lorraine said, and her tone had become almost condescending. If you have nothing to hide, why are you getting so upset? I'm upset because you invited me onto your show under the pretense of discussing my work, and instead you're attacking my character and my personal life, Gary said, his voice steady but filled with controlled fury. That's not journalism. That's a hit job. A hit job? Lorraine laughed, but it sounded forced. Don't be so dramatic, Gary. I'm asking perfectly reasonable questions. There's nothing reasonable about what you're doing, Gary replied. You've taken a comment I made about respecting writers and tried to turn it into some kind of controversy. Then, when that didn't get the reaction you wanted, you started bringing up my marriages. What's next? Are you going to ask me about my tax returns? My medical history? I'm doing my job, Lorraine insisted. I'm asking the tough questions that people want answers to. Bollocks, Gary said flatly, and the swear word hung in the air. The audience gasped again. You're not asking tough questions. You're being deliberately provocative because you want a viral moment. You want me to lose my temper so you can get clips all over social media. Well, congratulations, Lorraine. You're getting what you wanted. Lorraine's face flushed red. How dare you suggest that I would manipulate a guest for ratings? How dare I? Gary said, and now he was really angry. You just spent the last 10 minutes trying to paint me as some kind of backward-thinking, unstable person based on nothing. Absolutely nothing. You've twisted my words, you've invaded my privacy, and now you're acting offended because I'm calling you out on it? I think you need to calm down, Lorraine said, her voice taking on a warning tone. Don't tell me to calm down, Gary snapped. Don't you dare sit there and tell me to calm down after what you've just done. I've been in this industry for decades. I've done hundreds of interviews. I've never, ever been treated with such disrespect. Lorraine stood up from her chair, and the movement was so sudden it made Gary flinch. "If you feel that way, perhaps you should leave," she said coldly. Gary stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling as he tried to control his breathing. "Are you kicking me off your show? I'm suggesting that if you're not comfortable answering my questions, then maybe this isn't the right place for you," Lorraine said. "That's not what I asked," Gary said, standing up as well. "Are you kicking me off?" The two of them stood there, facing each other across the coffee table, and the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The audience was completely silent. Someone's phone could be heard ringing faintly in the background, but nobody moved to answer it. "I think we're done here," Lorraine said finally, her voice icy. Gary shook his head slowly, a look of disgust crossing his face. "You know what the saddest part is? I used to respect you. I used to think you were one of the good ones in this business. But this is shameful, Lorraine. This is beneath you." "Get off my set," Lorraine said, pointing toward the exit. "I'm going," Gary said, unclipping his microphone and dropping it onto the sofa. "But before I do, I want everyone watching to understand what just happened here. I was invited onto this show to talk about my work. Instead, I was ambushed with bad faith questions designed to make me look bad. That's not journalism. That's character assassination." "Security!" Lorraine called out, and two large men in suits began moving toward the set. "I don't need security," Gary said, holding up his hands. "I'm leaving." "But Lorraine, you should be ashamed of yourself. You really should." He turned and began walking toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent studio. The cameras followed him, capturing every moment. As he reached the edge of the set, he turned back one last time. "And for the record," he said, his voice carrying across the studio, "I stand by everything I've ever said about respecting writers and honoring good work. If that makes me controversial in your eyes, then so be it. But I won't apologize for having standards." Lorraine opened her mouth to respond, but Gary had already turned away. He pushed through the door at the back of the studio, and it swung shut behind him with a loud bang that echoed through the space. For a moment, nobody moved. Lorraine stood there, her face flushed, her breathing heavy. The audience sat in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling, not sure if they should cut away or keep filming. Then, slowly, someone in the audience began to clap. Then another person joined in. Then, another. Within seconds, half the audience was applauding, and it was clear they were applauding for Gary, not for Lorraine. Lorraine's face went from red to white. She looked out at the audience, clearly shocked by their reaction. "Right," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Well, that was certainly unexpected. We'll take a quick break." But the damage was done. The confrontation had been captured on camera, every word, every moment. Gary Oldman had walked off the set of Lorraine's show after one of the most heated arguments ever broadcast on morning television, and it was clear to everyone watching that he had been the one wronged. As the show cut to commercial, the audience continued to murmur and whisper, replaying what they just witnessed. Lorraine sat back down in her chair, trying to compose herself, but her hands were shaking as she reached for her glass of water. The producers were already rushing onto the set, their faces tight with concern. One of them leaned down to whisper in Lorraine's ear, and she nodded stiffly. The makeup artist appeared to touch up her face, but Lorraine waved her away impatiently. In the wings, crew members were pulling out their phones, no doubt already texting friends and colleagues about what had just happened. This wasn't going to stay contained to the studio. This was going to be everywhere within minutes. Back on set, Lorraine tried to gather herself. She shuffled her papers, took a sip of water, and forced her breathing to slow down. But there was no hiding the fact that something had gone terribly wrong. An interview that should have been a pleasant chat with a beloved actor had turned into a confrontational disaster, and the blame was falling squarely on her shoulders. The floor manager held up his hand, counting down from 5. When he pointed at Lorraine, signaling they were back on air, she plastered on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome back," she said, her voice strained. "Well, that was certainly an intense moment. Sometimes in television, things don't go as planned. We'll be right back after this message from our sponsors." But even as she tried to smooth things over, everyone knew the truth. This wasn't just things not going as planned. This was a host who had pushed too hard, asked the wrong questions, and driven away one of Britain's most respected actors. Gary Oldman had walked off the show, and he'd done it with his dignity intact. The door through which Gary had exited remained closed, but his presence still hung over the studio like a storm cloud. His words echoed in everyone's minds. Character, assassination, shameful, beneath you. These weren't words thrown around lightly, especially not by someone as measured and professional as Gary Oldman. In all his years in the public eye, through all the interviews and appearances, Gary had never done anything like this. He'd never walked off a set, never publicly called out a host, never lost his composure. The fact that he'd done it now, on Lorraine's show, said everything about how badly the situation had been handled. The audience members were still whispering among themselves, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief. A few were filming on their phones, despite the signs asking them not to. They knew they'd witnessed something significant, something that would be talked about for days, maybe weeks to come. Lorraine's remaining guests for the show were somewhere backstage, no doubt watching monitors and wondering if they should still come on. The atmosphere had been completely poisoned. How do you follow up a confrontation like that? How do you pretend everything is normal when one of the biggest stars in British cinema has just stormed off your set, accusing you of character assassination? The floor manager was gesturing frantically at Lorraine, trying to get her attention. She glanced over at him, and he mimed something about the next segment. She nodded, but her movements were mechanical, robotic. The confidence she'd had at the start of the show was completely gone. One of the cameramen zoomed in slightly on Lorraine's face, and for just a moment, you could see the real emotion there. Not anger, not defiance, but something closer to shock. Perhaps she hadn't expected Gary to fight back so forcefully. Perhaps she thought he would just brush off the questions and play along. But Gary Oldman wasn't the type to play along when he felt he was being treated unfairly. And she'd learned that the hard way. The commercial break seemed to last forever. Behind the scenes, phones were ringing. Producers were having urgent conversations. Someone from the network was probably already calling to find out what the hell had just happened and how they were going to handle the fallout. Because there would be fallout. There always was when something like this happened on live television. Social media would already be exploding with clips, reactions, and opinions. People would be taking sides. Think pieces would be written. The clip would be played on news shows and talk shows for days. And at the center of it all would be those 47 seconds where everything fell apart. Those crucial moments when a friendly morning chat transformed into something much darker, much more confrontational, and ultimately much more revealing about the person asking the questions than the person being questioned. Gary Oldman had walked off the show, but he'd done it with his head held high, his integrity intact. He'd called out what he saw as unfair treatment, and he'd done it clearly and forcefully. Whether you agreed with him or not, there was no denying that he'd stood his ground. Lorraine, on the other hand, was left sitting in her chair, trying to salvage what remained of the show, knowing that this would be the moment people remembered. Not the hundreds of successful interviews she'd done over the years, but this one. This confrontation. This failure. The floor manager counted down again, and the cameras went live. Lorraine smiled, but it was the smile of someone trying very hard to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The show continued, but everyone knew nothing would be the same after this. Gary Oldman had walked off, and in doing so, he'd exposed something that Lorraine Kelly probably wished had stayed hidden. The morning show format she'd perfected over decades had cracked, and the whole country had watched it happen in real time. That's what happens when you push someone too far. When you cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. When you forget that the person sitting across from you is a human being deserving of respect. Gary Oldman had reminded everyone of that, and he'd done it by simply refusing to accept treatment he knew was wrong. The door through which he'd exited stayed firmly closed, and behind it, Gary Oldman was presumably leaving the building, getting into a car, and putting this whole ugly episode behind him. He'd said what he needed to say, he'd made his point, and now he was done. Meanwhile, back on the set, Lorraine Kelly was learning a very public lesson about the consequences of letting an interview spin out of control. The show would end, the cameras would stop rolling, and the inquest would begin. But none of that could change what had already happened, what had already been broadcast, what millions of people had already seen. Gary Oldman had walked off, and with that simple act, he'd won.